All right, good to go.
I had to unmute myself. All right. Well, welcome everyone to tonight's Sierra Club meeting. This is the Robert Lunz group of the Sierra Club. We meet monthly, and this is our April monthly meeting. And we just want to say how thankful we are that we have this wonderful day and that you're all here, and we'll get right to it. All right. So we're the Robert Lunz Group. Like I said, we have over 1,400 members in Charleston, Berkeley, Colleton, and Dorchester counties. And the mission of the Sierra Club nationally is to explore, enjoy, and protect the planet. All right. So wanted to just go over a few of our leaders here. I'm Christina von Kalnitz. I'm the chair of the Robert Lunz Group Sierra Club. And we've got several leaders on the call. Laura was talking a few minutes ago, and Star Hazard, you'll see him in a few minutes. And I saw Pat Luck before we went into this mode. And I think a few more are on there too, but I didn't see them. So welcome to all of you. Thank you for coming. And just want to let you know, we do have a few positions open. We've got political chair open right now, and the treasurer position is open right now. So if anyone's interested in helping us out, we do have some political races coming up in the near future, and we could use some help with that. And we will walk you through both positions and give you any help, guidance. The National Sierra Club is very good about training, and we would welcome any of your help. So thank you. All right, volunteers. We need some volunteers in the Low Country. There is a dolphin count coming up, April 24th. Laura, I was wondering if you could put the sign up in the chat for us. Thank you. So Laura's going to put that in the chat if you're interested. They're going to count dolphins. You would go to this website and sign up to count, and you would pick a location that is predetermined in the Low Country, and you would just count the dolphins that you see and report that. And they've got a whole citizen science page ready for you to log in the number of dolphins you see. Why are we counting them? So of course it brings the community together. It collects valuable data for conservation, and it shows obstacles that humans cause, and it gives us insight into what we can do to change. It teaches us stewardship and sustainability. It connects us to the natural world and encourages our community to take action. So let's get out there and be citizen scientists and volunteer. And it's also an activity that we can do that's socially distanced right now. So that's a great part of this whole volunteer event. All right, we're going to talk about some outings. I just thought I'd show you some pictures here. I'll stop sharing my screen in a few minutes. We've got Bear Island over here in the top left, and Botany Bay in the bottom. And these other two pictures are from a location near Folly Beach. Star is going to show you his screen, and he is going to he's going to give you some information on how to get some outings of your own going in the Low Country. All right, Star, I'm going to stop sharing.
So always have to remember to unmute myself. Can you hear me? Here was a little page or two or three, four of things you can do on your own. The Sierra Club's outings program has been shut down because of the COVID-19 and distancing issues, and will not open up until the weekend of July 4th, and possibly not then, but we'll see. So I was asked to come up with a set of things that you might do on your own. And the first one that comes to mind is a lovely walk along the Palmetto Trail. If you go north on Highway 17, and there are links in this, we can put those, they've been in the news letter, so you can pick them up again there. A section of the Palmetto Trail, the Swamp Fox section of the Palmetto Trail. I'll scroll down here a bit. And it goes from over here on the right to the intersection begins at Highway 17 North, just past Steed Creek Road. And it goes across a very widely varied series of ecological samplings of the Francis Marion Forest. You'll see pecosins, you'll see upland longleaf pine forests, and you'll sort of lots of other lovely places to see. And it's a decent 6-mile hike one way. You have to work out your own shuttle. There's a campground up here at Halfway Creek Road, which is a convenient place to stop for this relatively short walk. Probably better in the cooler days than the warm ones. Another one not far from, in fact, more or less across Highway 17 from the Swamp Fox section is the Ondaw section of the Palmetto Trail. And this begins at Buck Hall and continues over to Highway 17. There's a canoe and kayak launch, which is a convenient place to go down. There's a parking spot right there. And this will take you along the Ondaw Creek and a place where there are actually some bluffs. Now, you don't normally think of the creeks around here as having bluffs, maybe some on the bigger rivers, but this is a tidal creek with a nice bluff. And you'll get to see images like this, or here's the actual map. The trail begins over here at Buck Hall and continues on over here to all the way to the trailhead if you wanted to go that way, all the way on Highway 17. You can also get out right down here at the canoe and kayak launch. You'll have to wear some boots at times. This section in here around the power line is going to be muddy, like several inches deep, not a foot deep, but 3 or 4 or 5 inches deep. So you want to be aware of that. Here's a view from one of the bluffs looking out over Ondaw Creek. It really is a lovely place to go on a bright and sunny day like today, for instance. The other direction from Charleston is go down to the Donnelly Wildlife Management Area south on Highway 17. And this is a wonderful place to go just for a drive, or you can drive into it and get out and walk this Boynton Trail. This is a lovely example of the low country, walking down across the salt marsh and some rice dikes, up a little bit of upland stuff, back again across the rice dikes, and then back and come back up here. Then even if you don't do the walk, this is a great place to go. If you stop up here at this kiosk, great place to, it's sort of upland up there, and you can see and listen to multiple kinds of woodpeckers, for instance, if you're interested. Anyway, a truly beautiful place. To point out, this is a mixed use area, which means it's used for hunting sometimes. So it's not a good thing to do in the fall because it'll be open for hunting. And you want to be able to check before you head out there. But again, it's mostly a winter kind of highway, or a winter kind of trip. The second most interesting place, not second most interesting place, but going back north of the Palmetto Trail access is the Santee Coastal Reserve. And what you see there is a picture of the Washoe Reserve in the Santee Coastal Reserve. And absolutely gorgeous. You can walk out on a little boardwalk to see this sort of view. This was taken in early spring. Anyway, one of the best places around to go for a lovely walk. Here are a series of maps of the Santee Coastal Reserve. Any of these trails is fine. Almost all of them can be biked. So from now on, probably you would want to do biking rather than walking. But again, all of these trails are accessible, at least to fat tire bicycles. One more, just south of town on Highway 17 is the Dungannon Nature Reserve, and a little picture of the Dungannon area. It's another reserve like the Washoe Reserve. Dates back from the time of rice culture before tidal efforts were introduced. A nice short little walk. Again, it's better in the winter months, the cooler months, and beginning probably about now. I've forgotten the dates. You can't go out on this boardwalk because the wood storks are going to begin to nest on at the end of the marsh in this area. So they want you to not be bothering them. Anyway, another lovely, absolutely lovely place to go for a little short walk here in the Low Country. So those are some things that you can do here around abouts. And we encourage you to get out, and we'll be back out officially, hopefully, after July 4th. Stay tuned.
Thank you, Star. That was fabulous. Love seeing all those locations. And I think I've been to all of them, so that's good. Let's see, there we go. I think, Laura, can you give me a thumbs up if you see my screen? All right, great, thank you. All right, so, you know, it struck me as I was putting this slide together and listening to Star that so many of our experiences when we go out into the wild are near water. And tonight's program, you know, is going to be talking about that. And we get out there and we enjoy these places because, you know, we love them and we want to protect them. So just wanted to share that thought that the Low Country is beautiful. We want it to remain beautiful, and we want to help as much as we can. In April, Earth Day is April 22nd. There's a lot of ways to learn about how you can help. So want to get right to this. April 7th, there's an Earth Day Eco Challenge, and it's a worldwide event. And it's gonna be online, and we'll put all this information into our newsletter, and we're going to send out a special Earth Day edition, and it'll have all these events and even more events that are also being planned. The College of Charleston is putting on the Earth Day Eco Challenge. They've also had a Climate Friday event going on, and April 9th will be their last one. And the Charleston Climate Coalition is going to be doing a bike tour on April 17th. That should be a great tour around Charleston, and they'll have speakers at each little location that they're going to stop. And then they're going to end up at the MUSC Urban Farm with a complimentary vegan lunch from Stone Soup Collective. So if you're interested in that bike tour, sign up early because the registration is going to be capped at 50. And then on April 22nd, Earth Day, from 3 to 5, there's going to be an online event discussing resilience in the 21st century. And that is going to be hosted by the College of Charleston. It'll be a faculty panel with members of the College of Charleston, the Citadel, and MUSC, all talking about different aspects of resilience. And then I've put the artwork in here because, you know, they're having an Earth Day art event. So if you're an artist and you'd like to participate, the theme is the future we want for our Earth. And the deadline to submit your artwork is April 15th. And you can submit that artwork at charlestonclimatecoalition@gmail.com. That the artwork will be displayed during the Tour to Earth Day on April 17th. All right, before we get to tonight's program, we want to talk about next month. Maggie Schober from the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy will be with us, and SACE promotes responsible and equitable energy choices to ensure clean, safe, and healthy communities throughout the Southeast. Maggie Schober is the Director of Utility Reform for SACE. She will give us a presentation about the electricity grid and South Carolina's power supply. And I have actually been to a few of SACE's webinars. They are fabulous. They do a great job. So join us again next month to hear more about that. All right, and without further ado, I'm going to introduce Christina Rae Butler, who has a book called Low Country at High Tide. And she's going to be giving us a presentation on that tonight, and we're really looking forward to it. She's a professor of historic preservation and chair of general education at American College of Building Arts. She's an adjunct faculty at the College of Charleston and the owner of Butler Preservation LLC. She will provide an illustrated synopsis of her recent book, Low Country at High Tide, Flooding, Drainage, and Reclamation in Charleston, chronicling the means and motives for filling and reclamation in the city over time, and how the city government and its residents have dealt with flooding in the past and present. So Christina, thank you for being here tonight. And I'm going to turn it over to you. But before I do that, I just want to let everyone know if you have questions during the presentation, please put them in the chat and we will have a Q&A after the presentation. So thank you.
Moment of truth. Can everybody see the PowerPoint? Wonderful. That's always the most stressful part of my day for every class I teach. And as Christine mentioned, we have beautiful weather for it. No thunderstorms, hopefully no internet outages. So perfect evening for this talk. So thank you all so much for being here tonight. My goal is to give you a semi-quick illustrated overview of the book, which came out last June 2020 with University of South Carolina Press. And I always, whether it's a fun crowd like y'all or students, I like to make myself a little outline so you know what journey we're headed on. So we're basically going to start at the very beginning of European habitation in Charleston, circa 1670. And we're going to do a short whirlwind 350-year tour. And we'll look both at motives and methods for filling and reclaiming in the city over time. And then towards the end, a good third of the slides are some frightening before and after images to look at where we are today in 2020, what floods and why, and some of the effects of 350 years of human interference, for lack of a nicer way to put it. And Charleston's story is actually really similar to a lot of coastal communities in that we weren't fools. We built on those few subtle bluffs that Starr mentioned first. And as our population grew and we started running out of good naturally occurring high ground, we got increasingly creative with filling and draining and literally reclaiming land out of the Cooper and the Ashley River. And it's a story that's echoed in Newport, Rhode Island, and New Orleans, Louisiana, and a host of cities in Europe. And while this isn't a new story or a new problem, I think this crowd especially understands how important it is to think about the future of our communities, sustainability, ecology. So Charleston, like a lot of historic cities with flooding problematically, is a place that is filled with some of the most important architecture in the United States. We've been trying, with some limited success, to make Charleston a World Heritage Site, to prove it's internationally significant as a cultural landscape. And whether it's Charleston or Venice, worldwide, some of our best, earliest, most important architecture is in some of the most at-risk landscapes. So why this book? You can probably tell by this Midwestern accent that I'm not originally from here. I came to the Low Country about 17 and a half years ago, and I'm from Cleveland, which does not have coastal flooding problems. And so I had very little frame of reference for how quickly an area in the Low Country can turn from road to creek. And as somebody who had been interested in built environment and engineering for most of my life, I got really interested in trying to figure out the how and why some areas were reclaimed well enough that they don't flood and why others flood catastrophically. And what started that journey was renting a wee apartment on Bouffane Street, across the street from the flood that you see on the screen. And we would have that increasingly common sunny day flooding where it's not raining, but the tides are so high that water will actually push out of the drains into the city. So after learning the hard way where not to park, like Starr was mentioning he had done also, I thought, well, there's got to be a good historic story behind this. So 12 years later, The book is finally out. So we're going to begin, as I mentioned at the very beginning, of Charlestown as a European city. And I love to start and end with historic maps and plats. So you are looking at the grand model, the original layout of the town of Charleston. And I think it's a great jumping off point, because whether you look at a Google map today or a plat drawn in the late 17th century, just because those lots exist on paper does not mean they're buildable at high tide. And so hosts of folks got free land grants for all of the little numbered half-acre lots you see throughout the city. And to orient you, this is the Cooper River and eventually East Bay at the bottom of the screen. And the crisscross in the middle is Meeting Street and Broad Street. So the city looks like a proper sort of Baroque laid out community, but it turns out that fully half of those lots were unbuildable without some serious human intervention. So not surprisingly, people with these back lots, which were literally marsh and swamp, left those fallow or used them as, marsh tacky horse grazing. And everybody started subdividing the lots on the high ground, which were located on a small bluff next to the Cooper River. So what the city actually looked like in 1710 was much smaller than that plat, that very idealistic, hopeful plat. So this is a little zoom in of a much larger map of the Low Country, published about 1711. And what you're looking at is Charlestonians' attempts to build on the good ground first. So to orient you, this triangle is a drawbridge, which had a water-filled moat into town. And that was the main land entrance into the town. And it's located roughly where Meeting and Broad Street intersect today. And very clearly on this map, you can see that our settlement is literally hemmed in by lowlands. So the big creek on the left is Vandrost Creek, today Water Street. And the big creek on the right is Market Street, formerly Daniels Creek. So again, it's not that hard to figure out by looking at a map where to avoid when it rains. But the fun story is how many times over the last 350 years, Charlestonians have tried every trick in the book to prevent this flooding. So jumping forward a bit to the modern era, I've picked out in black the French Quarter. That's roughly where that original walled city was. And you can see very little evidence on a good sunny day of where all the lowlands used to be. But if you look on the backside of the city, where the yacht club, the city marina is located, there's still just a few soft edges, and those are the vestiges of marshes and tidal creeks. And we have obliterated hundreds of acres of those. But as a Charlestonian in the colonial era, you would have seen those marshes surrounding almost every building site. So how and why are people filling in the early days of Charleston? Well, we had very little infrastructure, and I could do a whole talk just about drains, and I won't. I'm just going to hit some of the highlights, but suffice it to say, our early town was sort of post-medieval. We were here, the English, nearby were the French and the Spanish and Native Americans, who were all contesting the Low Country, fighting over whose it actually was. So Charleston was not a city. It was the colonial capital, but it wasn't a proper city with a mayor. So we didn't really have a lot of infrastructure planning. What urban planners today would call a comprehensive plan to guide how the city grows was non-existent in our early days. And most of our money, our colonial tax money, was being diverted towards fortifications, creating a walled city to protect the town on the high ground. And as the city grew, it became important to try and make sure you had causeways to get goods into the city. So transportation, always a key motive for filling. And one of the reasons we have such weird streets that just jog suddenly and have no sidewalks is because a lot of our early filling and development was done privately, what we now call speculative development. And for that reason, we have a lot of neighborhoods that don't really tie one to the next. And in between those neighborhoods, we have low spots that were never really filled correctly. Oop, get that to advance. So what did Charleston look like if you happen to be sailing into this colonial town? Y'all are looking at an inset from a bigger map from 1740, right before we had a massive fire that burned most of the buildings you see along the waterfront. But you can see really clearly in this map how perilously low the city is, how close we are to sea level. And it's relatively easy, relatively, to take a lake in a hilly area, take a valley and try and fill it, because you have earth that you can truck in. Well, here in the low country, we have a lot of sand, which you can't use for fill because you can't compact it. And we have a lot of pluff mud, but we don't actually have any rock indigenous to this part of the low country. And even if you found some good dirt and you dig it up, you create a new spot that floods. So I think this illustration is really effective in showing you how close we are to the maritime landscape. And the little triangles sticking out into the water are some of those urban fortifications I mentioned. So where those are located was determined by where the ground was high and original that could actually hold up all of that brick. That's, y'all, a half-mile long brick wall with over 1 million bricks that were diverted to its construction. And also important to remember, that wall is not just for fortifications. It's also our early seawall that kept East Bay Street from turning back into the Cooper River. So one of our first attempts, haphazard attempts to fill in the colonial era was actually accidental. And the term for this accidental accretion of land, coined by a Boston archaeologist, is wharfing out. So we have this hard brick wall on the high ground on the edge of the city. And the city grows primarily as a maritime center, import export. So private colonial merchants begin constructing log work cribs out into the rivers to create hard ground as wharfs that you can unload, enslaved people, sadly, onto, and load cotton onto ships to go somewhere else. So imagine, if you will, 3-block long wooden platforms sticking out into the river. And this plat shows some of those. And the stipply stuff is water, the docks in between those man-made wharfs. And imagine the action of the tide every day, pushing silt back in between those docks, and every bit of garbage we have that you can't recycle is getting dumped into those docks. And slowly over time, those areas become too clogged up to be able to dock a ship. And so your option in 1750 is to try and build a cofferdam, dredge that space, which is next to impossible, or fill that space as best you can and build your wharf further out into the river. And after about 100 years, that led to 3 acres of buildable land on the east side of East Bay Street. So that's why if you're walking down East Bay, all of the wharf streets like Faber's Wharf or Adger's Wharf go downhill. They're garbage accidental fill from the 18th century. And I love this plat. It's probably one of the favorite ones I've ever found, because you can see a floor plan, if you will, of a wharf and a dock, and it says dry at low water. It's already too silted up for a big boat. And at the bottom of the screen, you can see a little elevation that shows that log and pile construction. So these wharfs aren't like concrete piles with a deck on top. They're actually filled solid. So they are buildable, and you can see these warehouses constructed on that man-made fill. And then the stuff in between is accidental. The other big motive for filling, as it always is a quick way to make money, speculative development. So as that little colonial town starts to grow and get too crowded, enterprising Charlestonians started taking farms and lowlands and subdividing them to create new neighborhoods. And we think of that as being such a 20th century thing, but it actually was pretty common on both sides of the pond in the Georgian era. And the first two good examples from the 18th century are Harleston Village, which is about 5 blocks further into the Ashley River than it originally was. It has grown. And Hampstead Village, now better known as the East Side. So both of those communities were developed by private individuals, the Harleston family and the Lawrence family. And they purchased this land, carved it up into lots, but you can see really clearly in the little plat recreated of Hampstead how much of that neighborhood was low-lying. I live in the East Side on a relatively high lot that I bought because I do this for a living and I knew where to avoid. But America Street will turn back into a creek. And interestingly, the colonial folks who were advertising these lots, they used it as a selling point. They said, creekside lot, deep enough for a merchant to dock a boat. So kind of a positive spin. But half of those lots would have required a lot of fill to be buildable. And what people used historically was pretty unsanitary and not necessarily very stable for building large buildings on. So I've got for you here a historic plat of Harleston Village. And all of the squiggly lines are showing you basically topography, what's high and what's low. And I picked out in blue where Colonial Lake is, which is kind of in the river historically. And that little blue box at the corner of Wentworth and Pitt, I'm about to read you a fun quote, and this is in the book, so some of you have seen this, but if you've ever wondered what people used for fill, they used literally anything they could get their hands on. So this is an ad from 1783. It's right after the American Revolution, and it's for 2 lots, highest lots in the most beautiful situation within the lines of Charleston, meaning they're in the town. In Harleston Village, lately laid out in a garden, and it has been enriched by upwards of 1,000 cartloads of dung, by which we mean horse manure, besides the bodies of upwards of 800 Waldeckers, Hessians, and British, who were fortunate enough to escape being witness to the approaching disgrace of their arms. This is some really angry patriots selling basically a marsh front wartime mass grave. War is over, that land becomes valuable. They cap it with manure, which doesn't compact well, but we have a lot of it. Cap that with pluff mud and sell it as a residential building lot. So imagine how much that kind of organic fill, human remains and manure, is going to settle over time. There's actually a really pretty 1850s Greek Revival house on that lot today. And I'm sure they have no idea what's under it. But this is probably the most egregious example I found, but it's surprisingly common. Most of our pauper cemeteries, for example, are in low spots where land is cheap. The city grows, people forget about it, and then they build over those earlier landscapes. Where we start to do a slightly better planning job is when Charleston incorporates and becomes a city. And it's kind of boring government history, but we can't understate what a big deal this is. Charleston becomes a municipal government in 1783. And it means we now have a mayor and council members you as a resident can complain to about flooding. And it also means we can create, like we still do, commissions to respond to local needs. So from this moment forward, we have 2 main groups on behalf of the government who are trying to do good quality fill. The commissioners of streets and lamps are all about transportation, good bridges and causeways to get goods into the city. And by the way, this is a 1780 map from the Revolutionary War, and you can see that slow expansion, sort of north, east, west, and even south as Charleston's population grows. And you can see where Calhoun Street is today, that the peninsula is almost completely severed by creeks. So the streets and lamps folks are trying to keep King Street and Meeting high and dry. Our Board of Health, as the name would indicate, is all about keeping our city clean and safe, because you can't attract residents and business if everybody is dying of yellow fever and everything is flood prone. And this is before germ theory and before mosquito vector had been proven and discovered. But our Board of Health recognizes that people who live close to the waterfront get sick at a higher rate. because waterfront properties today in Charleston are beautiful, but historically it would have been the terminus for all of our drain lines, which had human and animal waste in them. It's where people are dumping garbage. And when the tide comes in, all of that debris would push back into those neighborhoods. So the Board of Health existed to try and get private owners to stop using dodgy fill. So just in the first period of Charleston, colonial to federal, the city grew so much. And I've picked out Market Street for you, which was completely filled in the 1780s, completed about 1808. And you can see that that was the northern edge of the city. And by 1780, we had just expanded and ballooned outward. So jumping into the semi-modern era, once we hit the antebellum period, Charleston's government expands even more, and our population was growing, so our tax revenue was as well. And I'm going to show you some fun pictures in a moment of each of these types of infrastructural developments. But in this period, Charleston really for the first time created pre-planned city-funded reclamations. And those today are the most popular parts of our city. White Point Garden at the southern tip of the peninsula and the High Battery seawall. We also finally constructed a proper drain trunk system. So before we jump into those pictures, just to tell you what you're looking at on the screen, this is an 1854 section plan of the Battery seawall. So this is designed by a city civil engineer. He's making the city import stone. He's trying to plan infrastructure that lasts, much more permanent than that accidental wharf fill we were talking about in the earlier decades. So the fruits of their labors, again, are some of the most beautiful parts of our city. So when you walk on the High Battery seawall, the top of it's from the 1850s, post-hurricane of 1854. The base of it is from about 1818. And that sits on top of two earlier attempts to try and create a seawall. So it's really easy to date Charleston's architecture once you start thinking about the age of the infrastructure on which it is built. Everything down there is antebellum because that area didn't exist prior to the construction of the battery. So the city was smart. They basically paid for that project by selling those beautiful waterfront lots. And you'll notice there are no wharfs sticking off of that, and there never were. That was always supposed to be a pretty residential part of the city. So a very different waterfront than the industrial waterfront, the shipping waterfront. So by 1844, when this map was created, you can literally see Charlestonians slowly erasing all of the lakes, turning them into mill ponds, cutting them off with causeways, and then slowly filling them to turn them into residential neighborhoods. And all of these streets sticking out the west side of the peninsula, that's the slow expansion of Harleston Village and Cannonboro, Elliottboro out into the rivers. Our big, probably coolest infrastructural development of the 19th century was our tidal drains. And I think it was Laura, or it might have been Christine, who was mentioning that occasionally the city will open up the manhole covers and they'll have to do work inside these drains. And it's amazing to see that there is still tide water running through them, almost like a tidal creek. And for anybody, speaking of stars walking tours, he was mentioning to y'all, if anybody's been out to a rice plantation or a former rice field, you know that those landscapes are all about water control. So our tidal drains, very similar to rice field drainage. You have these large brick trunks, tunnels that run river to river and down the center of the peninsula. And they were fitted with floodgates. So if you knew a storm was coming, you could empty them out at low tide, close the gates, and keep them empty so that they could hold storm water. Similarly, if they were full and you closed the gates and you waited for the dead low tide and you opened the tidal gates, it would basically flush those drains out. So they had kind of a built-in cleaning mechanism for all the horse poo and things that would get down into those drains. Amazing infrastructure, hand excavated in the 1830s and the 1850s. And here's what they look like inside. This is courtesy of the City of Charleston Public Works. This brave young man is crawling through the drains, trying to inspect and looking for any brick that might cave in, because there is a lot of weight of paving above these. And you can see this sludgy black line. That is the typical high water line when the tides fill up those drains. The scary thing is for this young man, and why the city sometimes still floods, is we're at sea level and these are tidally influenced. So if it rains really hard at high tide, these drains are already full and inundated, and water will come through them into the city. And Charleston knows that. We try and put backflow diverters on them to prevent that. So there's limitations to it, but this was a citywide, comprehensive, hand-built, really advanced system for its time period. Kind of skipping over the American Civil War because, as you know, not much was done because there was bigger issues going on, but jumping sort of forward into the Victorian era. This is a great little map of Charleston in 1872. And for those of you who are map nerds like me, this one is available for free on Library of Congress. And you can zoom in very close on any part of the city. And what's great about this map is it has little three-dimensional drawings of every house in the city. So it shows you a lot of built environment. And conveniently, it also shows you firsthand the wharfing out along the Cooper River that we talked about, and the slow growth of the west side of the peninsula. And all of these causeways you see sticking out where the on-ramps are to James Island today, those are tidal ponds that are used to power mills. So both sides of our city would have had a lot more industry than we typically see today. And so one fun example of that is Colonial Lake. It began as part of the river. It was impounded to create a mill pond. And over time, you can actually see some little houses in the lake. The city proposed filling it to make a new city block. And no exaggeration on this, they were using street sweepings and slaughterhouse remains. And you can imagine what that smelled like dumped in a lake in the Charleston summer. So everybody who lived around it complained. And the city gave up and decided in 1881 instead to make it into a Victorian reflecting pond. But in its core, it's actually one of these old tidal ponds. And for anybody who has ever walked and looked at it, you know that it rises and falls with the tide because it still has one of those drain conduits that connects it to the Ashley River. And jumping forward to the 1950s, you can see that lake completely landlocked by all of the later development, whereas in 1872, it's riverfront. Okay, next big project is Murray Boulevard, better known as the Low Battery. And like the earlier antebellum version, this was a city project. Charleston created 47 new acres of buildable land by creating a piled concrete wall, pumping dredge spoils out of the river over the wall to make landfill, and capping it with a concrete or asphalt street. So one fun, quick thing about Murray Boulevard, worst possible timing, because this thing is under construction during World War I, and there was a massive worker and material shortage. So it was way over time and way over budget. They cut a lot of corners on it, which is why it's having to be rebuilt as we speak. But, you know, it's great, typical early 20th century growth. And what I mean by that is this is planned, unlike the early stuff. So if you take a look at this plat in the background, that squiggly line is the original water line as it existed in 1910. And all of those picture perfect lots are speculative, built out of the Ashley River. And so when you drive on Murray Boulevard, that's all man-made. And it's kind of scary when you consider the size of those houses basically sitting on river dredge spoils. You got to pile stuff pretty well to build down there. So starting to jump forward in time, and I'm going to pop on a light because it's getting dark. There we go. Once we start moving forward, Charleston, like all cities, begins to modernize. And I believe y'all are going to have the Charleston Waterkeepers folks visiting you for a virtual tour soon. And one of the things they're interested in is trying to preserve Gadsden Creek and Gadsden Green, which is a public housing estate. And it's not a mistake that most of our housing projects are so flood prone. We got federal money in the New Deal and post-World War II to clear privately owned slum housing and replace it with modern public housing. But that land was cheap and low lying. So the new stuff we built in its place has the same flooding problems that the earlier stuff did. And of course, you have to remember that it's very difficult to get to and from these flood prone areas because the streets turn into rivers. So to show you one quick visual, probably one of the higher profile ones, this isn't Gadsden Green, this is Gadsden Borough. And if you're wondering where that is, because it no longer exists, this is that big new area where they're building the International African American Museum over by the Cooper River. So you're looking at Gadsden Borough neighborhood as it existed in the 1870s. And you can see it's very much a mercantile waterfront, small working class houses. These are the houses as they appeared in 1942, when the city proudly bought up all of these Negro dwellings, rental properties, and razed them. They built a large public housing complex. It flooded 8 foot deep during Hurricane Hugo and was subsequently demolished. And today, when you look at that great site where they're building the new museum and you see Gadsden Borough Park, there's almost no reminder that that's a working class neighborhood that always used to flood. Because when the city started redeveloping it, they attempted to fix the drainage. But if you have ever tried to go to the Harris Teeter, when it's high tide, you know that that area, Concord and Washington Street, will still turn back into the Cooper River. Water always remembers its course. So another fun visual, kids racing goat carts up and down the handmade causeways. That is roughly where Lockwood Boulevard is today, and the city marina and the old yacht basin. So kids running around on these causeways you see picked out on this map. And by the 1950s, most of that had been completely filled, turned into the medical district, new housing. So that big brick entity is West Point Rice Mill, which today is kind of landlocked, but used to be on an island all by itself in the river. So jumping into modernity, and we're about to get to the fun before and after pictures, where Charleston really begins to modernize is these couple decades right after World War II. And so by the late 60s, we do have federal wetlands acts, which y'all at Sierra Club are familiar with. They are about trying to prevent the loss of coastal wetlands. So it became really difficult to get permits to continue filling low-lying areas. We upgrade our drains. Charleston, this is fun, finally gets a sewage treatment plant in 1960s. And that might not seem important, but prior to that point, all of our sewer lines expel with centrifugal pumps untreated into the Charleston Harbor. So at high tide, all of that would come right back up next to the city. So slowly but surely, we update our infrastructure. And right before those wetlands acts kick in, we do our last big filling projects up by the Citadel where Haygood Stadium is, and to create Lockwood Boulevard. And those are done with sanitary fill. And that's what you see on the screen. It's where you take garbage, you pick all the organic debris out of it, you throw it in the marsh, and you compact it. So car frames, construction debris, cardboard boxes, but at least not horse carcasses and diapers. So slightly more sanitary than earlier fill. So to jump to what Charleston looks like today, we have grown literally every direction. And thanks to the fact that you can't clog up a shipping channel like the Cooper River, and thanks to Federal Wetlands Act, our geographic footprint is pretty much complete. So now we have to deal with the ramifications of all of that earlier activity. So picked out in blue is East Bay Street, which used to be the edge of Charleston. So all of that Ports Authority parking is all of that wharfed out reclaimed land done accidentally over time. And if you ever get a chance, if you haven't already, the best place to see what our early seawall looked like is by going into the basement or dungeon under the old exchange building. And you see it on the left as it appeared in 1739 on one of those historic maps. And the building that is there today is from 1771. But down in the basement, you can still see that half moon that used to be waterfront. And notice how it's spalling and just crumbling apart because it has been sitting in salt water for most of its life. So that exchange building doesn't make sense to tourists because it's landlocked, but historically it was waterfront. So to show you zooming out, that building used to face the river, and today it's completely blocked in on every direction. This another fun one. And I love this because it's a great illustration of some of those crib work, early constructed wharves. So this is a private wharf for the Chisholm family. Got their big, classical revival house. This is an 1865 photo, which is why there is a Hunley-like submersible in the mud at low tide. Today, that is completely landlocked by that Murray Boulevard, 47 acres of fill in the early 20th century. And this is covered back up, but really great visual. About a decade ago, the College of Charleston and the Mayor's Walled City Task Force got the chance to try and dig on South Adgers Wharf, which is right across from Rainbow Row. And they were trying to find the original seawall, and they were looking for those big triangular gun emplacements. So that little yellow thumbtack looked like this in the 1780s. And you can see the original waterfront seawall that they were knocking down because the war was over. And you can see some of that wharf expansion. And what that looks like when you get a chance to dig into the ground is actually pretty cool. So this thing is surrounded by later fill, but what you're looking at is actually 3 phases of Charleston engineering. 1690s, 6-foot thick brick wall, hand built and hand excavated. And this big wad running through it is an 1850s tidal drain, one of those big brick arches. And then that gray line next to it is a 1960s sewer line. So you can literally see Charleston adding infrastructure and growing. And unfortunately, they had to cover it back up, but there is a little brick paving in the street to show you where that used to be. So the epilogue, to kind of bring us full circle, is that Charleston is almost twice the size it originally was. And some of that is full-blown reclamation out of the rivers. Some of that is just filling low lots. But those historic drains are still our main mode of drainage. We've got increasingly high tides. We've developed pretty much every bit of ground that we can, yet we continue finding more spaces to build. And we have a lot of organic fill that is just settling because it was never compacted correctly. So I have a much better job as a historian telling you why it is the way it is. It is not fun to be a city civil engineer that has to try and sort this stuff. It's expensive and it's tricky. So it's, again, not hard to figure out what's going to flood. MUSC is in one of the most flood prone parts of the city. And one of the main questions I get is why on earth you would build a medical district in a mill pond. And the answer was that was some of the only undeveloped land available. So folks did what they had to. Fishburne Street, US 17 Crosstown, Haygood Stadium, all in a naturally occurring tidal basin and filled with that sanitary fill, but still slowly settling. Flooding at the Battery. So this is a well-engineered seawall from the 1850s, and you have these beautiful amenities like the Victorian bandstand. But unfortunately, 4 times in the last 6 years, we've had a pretty significant flood. The problem is at high tide, there's nowhere for the water to go. And if water crests over that wall, the wall acts as a bathtub and it's very difficult to drain the water back out. And the way people dealt with that historically is they built their houses on raised basement with no air and B&Bs in the basement. It was open air. So as we've modified houses and made more livable space in basements, we now have created a bunch of spaces that are going to keep flooding. And similarly, the low battery, which exists on paper and looks great, looked like this after Hurricane Maria. Y'all, that was only a Category 1, but it was just enough rain at high tide to basically have the water reclaim where it used to be river. And you can see the streets flooded. And as soon as you get to original high ground, that area didn't flood. So what's the city doing kind of to wind it all together? Well, it's expensive to fix this stuff, but the city of Charleston is actively doing improvements. So one of the worst spots in our seawall is where the high battery and the low battery met, 2 different phases of construction. So a few years ago, they built this massive cofferdam, pulled up all the historic slate, drove massive concrete piles, and basically reinforced that highly at-risk corner of the peninsula because it gets storm water every direction. So that was a multi-million-dollar project, and it turned out beautifully. And for the first time ever, there was a wheelchair ramp so everybody could enjoy the high battery. And they put the flagstones down so it still looks pretty historic. Then you've got all those tidal drains and their limitations. So we've got about 10 of these new pumping stations throughout the city. So basically, they are designed to take storm water into a 10-foot diameter drain. 50 to 60 foot below grade would have been literally impossible to build that historically without, mechanized build pumps. And when the city floods, places like the market that you see on the screen, water goes into these tunnels and it hits a pump, and the pumps expel that water back into the river. And you're probably thinking, well, wait a minute, if it's high tide, isn't the water going to come right back into the city? And the answer is yes. And the engineers aren't stupid. They know that. But what these big, expensive pumping stations do, as soon as it stops raining, they allow those areas to drain in a matter of 15 minutes instead of 4 hours. So it gets the flood water out much more quickly. So if you've been driving down Cannon Street or Spring, and you've seen all the cranes, some of that is for new hotels, but some of that was sinking one of these big new drain shafts to try and keep MUSC and President Street from flooding, or at least help them drain more quickly. So what about the historic houses? Well, admittedly, some of those houses were built too low in the first place. Some of those houses are in areas that flood more now than they used to. So our city's Board of Architectural Review has gotten much more proactive in allowing owners to take historic houses and elevate them. And it can lead to slightly taller houses, and the streetscape might change, but it's better than losing a house that keeps flooding. And it can look really attractive if you do it right, because it was a very traditional thing to build your house up. But instead of on stilts, there would usually be a solid wall on the front. So we're now basically recreating Palladian Georgian ways of building with these formal foundations below our houses. So I'll leave you guys with a couple epilogue slides and then open it up to questions. Pretty much any area that is filled can revert back to water if we have a bad storm at high tide. College kids think it's amusing, but that is some gross water you don't want to be swimming in. So Reed and America and Hampstead, one of our colonial reclaimed neighborhoods, will get deep enough to take a motorized John boat down. King and UG Street, where that Shell gas station is, will get 3 foot deep. So that car is bobbing. It's not actually driving on pavement. And imagine, and maybe some of you have made this mistake, how unfortunate it is if you're a tourist and you don't know that's going to happen and you don't know any better and you find out the hard way. And admittedly, the city's not really great about advertising this because it's not a selling point. But if you move here, it's stuff you have to learn. So the last big project on the horizon, you guys have probably heard that there is a $2 billion seawall. I can't really say in the works because it's not that far along yet, but the Army Corps of Engineers is trying to figure out how to keep the peninsula from flooding. And this picture isn't exactly what they've proposed, but this is one of the big dams or levees in the Gulf. And Charlestonians are really concerned because you can't have that next to a historic city. It ruins the context. But the flip side is you can't do nothing or you lose the houses. So there is still a lot up in the air. But the plan is potentially to basically build a new seawall that completely buffers our original historic seawalls. And they're not quite sure how far to carry that up the neck. And they haven't really looked at how that might inadvertently cause flooding elsewhere. But the good news is, if nothing else, the feds are paying attention and the city of Charleston is also trying to be proactive and plan for the future. So my last slide for you is tying it full circle to what we started with. Just because a map makes it look like land exists doesn't mean it does at high tide. So I think the best reflection of where to avoid is looking at historic Charleston on a map done by some engineers in 1949, better known as the Halsey map, HALSEY. And you can see the blue line of the peninsula versus the original high ground. And when you consider that we're using garbage and hand compacting and building these drains by hand, it really is amazing how much we managed to create. And now we just have to figure out how to preserve it for the future. So with that, I will turn it over and see if anybody has any questions. And I think Christine is going to try and vet those for anybody who's been typing. So we can start with that. And then if you're all right with it, we can always have folks unmute if they want to chime in.
All right. So let's look at the chat. One person said lots of bird. That was in one of those photos. It was in one of the old maps, the one that was like the low battery or the high battery, where that is, where the wharves are. There were a lot of birds up top. So thank you, Christina. That was fabulous. I loved hearing all that history, and I can say that I've worked for 2 institutions that were digging to build new buildings, and they both found bodies when they did their digging. So you are 100% correct. There are plenty of bodies under there. And I've worked for 2 institutions that flooded in Charleston.
Yeah, it's sadly very common, and it's so easy for us to forget where those graveyards are, especially if they weren't marked well. And then you find just layers of things by surprise in Charleston. The classic is where folks try and drive piles to build a new house, and they can't drive piles because they hit so much brick and construction junk from the 1920s. You know, everything is there for a reason. We just sort of forget until we find it and learn the hard way.
Right. And you said you could do a whole presentation just on drains, and we might just take you up on that.
I love drainage.
So don't tempt us. We can do that. All right. So John Butterfield is asking, do you have any extra special information about Stoll's Alley?
I don't, but actually my husband, who is also a nerdy historian, did a podcast a couple years ago about Stoll's Alley and the history of that street and when it was paved. It is like a lot of the smaller courts in that it was not part of that original grand model. It's one of those streets that was cut through by speculative developers so that they could subdivide the back parts of these lots that used to go like almost from East Bay Street to Church Street. That would just be 2 lots. And those would have been huge. So, the Stoll family who owned it cut through. I actually do have, I don't think it made the book. I do have a plat that shows some of the lowlands that used to be on the East Bay side of Stoll's Alley. Christine, if you're willing to jot down his name and email it to me, because I'm forgetful and I have a mind like a sieve, I will follow up and send you the couple plats that I have for that street. But you'll have to remind me.
I understand. Trust me. All right. Next question. Nicole says, where can we hear you speak more, or are there tours?
Ah, so funny you mentioned tours. I used to be a tour guide, and now, I don't do that tons, but there is about to be a conference. It's June 13th through 15th, and it's an annual conference called Keeping History Above Water. And it's a preservation conference about how to deal with all of these issues we talked about tonight. And I am doing 2 walking tours for part of that conference. So that each one will be probably an hour and a half to 2 hours, and we'll be walking around these areas, and I'll be printing some plats and kind of explaining how those areas grew. And then I periodically do versions of this of various lengths. So I'm going to do a shorter version April 22nd for the Preservation Society. But yeah, I have left to my own devices, I'll talk for 3 hours. So I have lots of lengths. Yeah, so check out Keeping History Above Water, because that's going to be a pretty amazing conference. They've got some fabulous speakers. It's an academic conference, but there's cocktails in like Society Hall. It's going to be a fun one with some landfill walking tours.
Hey, well, the good thing about evening Zooms is there could be cocktails there too.
That's true.
Yes. And they're fun. So Longitude Lane, John Butterfield is interested in that as well. He's wondering if you have any special research or information about that.
So that one is less low lying. Stoles is a little further south. So that's an area that would have been, flooded at high tide at the East Bay end and then buildable at the Church Street end. Whereas Longitude, it also didn't exist. It's something that got cut through to subdivide. But that is on that little bluff along the Cooper River that was naturally occurring high ground. So that one really doesn't have too much fill or flooding. There is a tidal drain that runs diagonally, or I don't know if it's still active, but there was a tidal drain that ran diagonally kind of underneath that street and would have terminated out through the old seawall that's now landlocked by Hazel Parker Playground and all that new stuff that's right there. So it would have not been flood prone, but it would have been on the edge of the waterfront. And I didn't mention, but there was a big hurricane in 1752. And there's some eyewitness accounts that have been published. And Charlestonians mentioned that it was deep enough on Church Street, which is the high ground at the other end of, what's now Stoles Alley and Longitude. It was deep enough that they had to retreat to second stories of their houses. So when we get a really bad one at high tide, even the high ground is at risk. And I think Nick did a podcast about Longitude Lane too. So check that out. Charleston Time Machine is the name of it.
Oh, he has some fabulous podcasts. He really does.
Thank you.
Definitely
Not to be,
recommend it.
plugging.
So, so around MUSC, they Star says they built after driving deep pilings, and he wants to know if these pilings go down into rock or some marl layer.
They go to a marl layer because there is no bedrock shelf underneath us. So we didn't talk much about it, but there's a subsidence issue too, where there's not really a rock shelf underneath. So the peninsula, even if we hadn't messed with it, can potentially kind of slough out or subside from below. So basically, imagine, for those of you not familiar with marl, imagine taking a cube of cheddar cheese and putting cream cheese on top of it and driving a bunch of toothpicks to create a grid and then building MUSC on top of it. And it works because you're basically just driving hundreds of piles in a grid. And that is substantial enough to take the weight of those massive buildings. But no, they're almost kind of floating in the marl. They don't hit stone. Yeah, it's kind of scary.
I hope they stay up because I work in some of them.
Well, I will mention
All
this
right,
is
so,
a fun story shared by a physician now in his 80s. And he remembers back in the 70s, he was having lunch and he had earphones on and he was watching them drive the piles. When you first start driving, they'll go in pretty far and they go in exponentially less far every time you slam it because they're hitting more suction and resistance. He's watching this pile and all of a sudden it just went and it disappeared because it made it through the marl and it just went away. That's why you need a lot of them.
I guess you got to move over a few inches. All right. So anything you can say or discuss about orphans or orphanages in Charleston?
Actually, yeah, there were several. There was an almshouse on Columbus Street, close to where I live, but it was only for adults. And so if somebody happened to be in the almshouse, the poorhouse, even though you weren't technically an orphan, the city would put you in a city facility. So we had a large, actually really pretty mansard roofed city orphanage on Calhoun Street, actually on decent ground, close to where St. Philip's is today. And that was demolished in, I want to say around 4950. I can't remember the exact year. And it's under the Lightsey Center thing that's behind Francis Marion Hotel. So that was a city facility for white children. And because things were segregated in Jim Crow after the American Civil War, some of the Black fellowship groups created Black orphanages. The most famous one being Jenkins Orphanage, which their building was an 1820s Marine hospital next to the old city jail on an area that is and was heavily flood prone. And it's located there because the land was cheap. So yeah, kind of a host of orphanages because this was a city where mortality statistics were pretty severe.
Absolutely. Yeah, my one of my grandmothers grew up in the orphanage on Calhoun Street.
Such a pretty
Calhoun
facility.
and I guess, yeah.
Yeah.
So
So
Calhoun and King, I guess it was that corner.
yeah, which is a good high spot. So if you're looking for more information, the Orphan House records for the city facility are at the Charleston County Public Library, and they actually have all the handwritten applications for the kids and when they would give them apprenticeships. Amazing paper trail for those kids.
All right. So David wants to know about buying property. So you mentioned that you knew what you were doing, so you were able to buy property where it wasn't going to flood quite so bad. So he wants to know, are real estate agents obligated to tell you about flooding on your lot, and do you need to hire some sort of professional to study this, or do you have to do it all by yourself and get maps and figure it out?
Very great questions. So if an area has flooded and you ask, they are legally required to disclose that, much like you have to sign a waiver that there could be lead paint in the house if it's pre-1978. So they do have to disclose that. The issue being if it's a vacant lot and there was a house that was raised, that record, is gone. There's nobody to ask. And it's to your own knowledge. So if somebody bought that house in 2015 and it hasn't flooded since, it's kind of, I don't want to say don't ask, don't tell, but it's not like those records always exist. So a real estate agent or an owner who hasn't lived here long may not have knowledge of that. In most of the peninsula, to get a mortgage, you would have to have flood insurance because the bank doesn't want to lose their investment on a high risk property. So there is some government oversight, but if you were to buy property for cash, you aren't required to get a flood elevation survey. The bank makes you do that. You as a private owner don't have to. And there may not be anybody who can disclose that if it's a new owner. So anything I was going to buy anywhere in the Low Country, I would have a new base flood elevation survey done to figure out exactly how high it is. Even if there's already a house there, you're going to pay high flood insurance on the peninsula. And there's a chance if the house is on decent ground and is built on a raised basement, you might have a much better rate on your flood insurance. So it's worth paying the $500 to have a surveyor do a proper survey of that lot for sure, for new construction or something that already exists.
So Julia wants to know if there's any consideration of building reservoirs or cisterns to hold water until it can be discharged at low tide.
Yeah, great question. So the big drain lines that run below the historic drain lines, they sort of serve that function, but we're so low. Reservoirs are tricky. We're almost like New Orleans, where like you could try and build a big levee above ground to create a reservoir in, but if it ever breaches, then you're in a lot of trouble. So what works a little bit better is doing smaller cisterns in your own yard and doing permeable driveways, having French drains that'll help perk the water off more quickly. So that is a little bit more effective, because as soon as you try and dig something to make a reservoir, the water table is so bad it starts like if I dig a post hole in the back corner of my lot at 3 foot, it starts filling up with water, which makes making retention ponds kind of tricky. But we should leave alone the historic ones that still exist, like Alberta's Sotilly Long and Colonial Lake. Leave them alone. Don't try and fill next to them.
So at MUSC, we are on the higher ground at MUSC. We're going to be storing about 55,000 gallons of water under a new addition building.
Nice.
And it'll be sort of like a cistern, and it will drain at when it can drain, when the drains around the MUSC are clear.
Cool.
So
yeah, if you got high ground,
that's a little bit higher ground.
Yeah, nice. And you know, historically, people had cisterns under almost every house to collect the rainwater for drinking water and washing water. But if you didn't line it really well, it would turn into brackish water if it was a low-lying lot, because stuff would seep into it. Not to mention privy runoff. So you had to be careful with those things.
So another question is, where do people get their drinking water from? If they're filling in all these creeks and, there's all salt water surrounding the city, how did they get that?
Yeah, great question, because most of it's tidal water. It's brackish. You can't really drink it. It's salty. So people would try and tap wells. And in some areas, you can get away with that. In other areas, it'll be too salty. So people relied on cisterns that would collect rainwater and storm water. And then, because we didn't start piping in water until like the late 19th century. So you kind of sorted yourself with whatever you could create on your lot. And then there were some city wells. And then in the antebellum era, we built artesian wells, because it got sulfured up and ruined after Hurricane Hugo, but it used to be potable water. So there was little pumping stations all over the city where you could go and bring jugs and get proper artesian water to bring home. So very, very piecemeal. And now we pipe in our water from like Edisto and Goose Creek, which is a pretty far distance. That's how far you have to go to get proper fresh water out of a river.
It's a lot of maintenance and a lot of city efforts and town efforts to get all this infrastructure built. So thank you again, Christina. We don't want to keep you all night. You said you could talk, and we could talk. We want to hear everything you have to say. I do want to let everyone know that we recorded tonight's presentation and the Q&A, and it will be posted to the Robert Lunz Group website very soon. And if you want to hear more about our programs and you want to sign up for our newsletter to get those Earth Day listings of everything that's happening during the whole month of April. Sign up as well is on our on our website. Just thank you everyone for coming tonight. Thank you all for your great questions. This has been a fabulous presentation. There have been a lot of people in the chat saying how great the presentation was and sending their thanks to you, Christina. So again, great job. Thank you everyone, and hope you have a great night. Do you have anything, final words, Christina?
Just to thank you guys so much for spending your Thursday evening with me. Again, I could talk for ages and I won't. I'd be, honored to come back. It was a great time chatting with y'all. And I don't know what the median age of the group is, but, regarding speaking, I do tour guide lectures, I do various things, but if you are anybody who happens to be over 65, you can audit classes at College of Charleston. And that's fun because I think it's $25, which is a nominal fee. And you can take the classes and you can attend when you feel like it, and you don't have to do the papers. So, you may like my intro to preservation class if you ever want to join. Yeah, just thanks for giving me an hour and a half of your time. I really appreciate it.
Oh, we're the ones who really thank you and really appreciate you. Loved everything. Really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, y'all.
All right, y'all. Have a great night. See you next time.
Bye.